So thank you for those of you who came back. As I mentioned, some of the questions that were being raised in our discussion area about some of those things that people need to think about. By people, I mean jurisdictions, really need to think about with adoption of different standards. And so that actually is one thing we did want to do today, is have Jennifer Welch kind of walk through, what does it mean from an ordinance and policy guide to adopt this? What are the things that you need to be considering? So Jennifer, I will turn things over to you.
All right, sounds good. So this section comes off of the sheet that you were given as a handout, section 7, the 2-page, 14-point sheet that was in the Unified Sizing Criteria chapter that was sent out. Just to help, these are some of the things, prior to, talking about this process, when other communities are like, hey, we're going to adopt ISWIM, there's some information that you need to know to have based on the fact that ISWIM was written as a guideline and not necessarily a standard. So they really worked harder at, when it was put together, to write language that doesn't convey requirements. So the words of shall and must, those types of words aren't in there. So that means that there's some gray areas if it gets adopted without some additional information or documentation with it. What's required, what's recommended, what's optional, what do you mean if you say you adopt it? So this particular section goes through what some of those things are, and I'm going to just bring some of them up so that we can have a discussion about some of them, and not necessarily to get totally in the weeds with them, but to kind of understand some of the items that will need to be addressed in order to have the language that we want to get the outcomes that we're looking for in this process. So one of the things that came up is these terms about providing adoption guidance. So it's not just about adoption guidance, but also about design guidance, because when you're looking at a design, one of the things that we found is, see, you're trying to design a stormwater wetland, and you're like, ooh, I'm having trouble making all these meet because they kind of are all nested and working together. Which thing is most important? Which thing if I can't quite achieve, can we make some concessions on? And so that's kind of the thought process when you're in the design is, okay, what's most important? What are the different areas that you want to talk about? So is it essential? Is it a critical design element for the performance, for operation, for aesthetics? Or what's most important for inclusion and compliance and rarely should be deviated from? Those things in the newer chapters that we're putting together, we're highlighting as essential. Targets are, important design elements. You should include them if at all possible, but there's a little more flexibility in there for deviations if you're, trying to meet something that's infeasible at a location, or what we once in a while have is, you get some conflicts between what's required and, what might you be able to give on in order to make the thing work. So, if designers have changes in that, they have to be able to share that so you understand what they're not meeting. And then advisory, practices, techniques, deviation from the design ethic to avoid in most circumstances. So an example of what that might look like in the design guidance in the manual, so from this is the ability to address the unified sizing criteria, and you can see where they're marked advisory, essential, target, so that you kind of know, well, what are the key things, what's most important, how do you fit them all together when you're looking at your design. So the newer chapters have this already inserted in them. The older chapters, see, this manual thing never ends. We get to go back and add that language. Or as we go forward in adopting these guidance and standards, those are things that you'd want to think about. So another thing you want to think about based on, this sheet in there is there's these key items that you should address. So these 2 pages list those 14 items that will really help us and jurisdictions remember the key things to be addressed when deciding how to use the manual and ISWIM as part of the stormwater ordinances. So one of the things to do is, what unified sizing criteria elements are going to be enforced by the jurisdiction. So, this was written as, hey, if you're just picking this up and going with it, clearly define what is the basis, what are your allowable release rates? We kind of talked about them at our table, some of them. Are we talking about natural conditions, 5-year, what is it, so that you have sort of a numeric standard, not just, hey, follow ISWIM. And then if there's specific curve numbers that you want addressed when you're looking at them. And then we talked about these terms, but how are these terms viewed as part of the standard? Do you, have a method to treatment of them? That will help determine which ones are standards and what are guidelines as you go about adopting. And then identifying the thresholds. If you're talking about new development or redevelopment, what are the trigger for local stormwater management requirements? Are they, the size of impervious area, a disturbed acreage, the size of a building addition, changes in land use, removal of vegetation, some of those things. When is this guidance triggered? And then there might be some special geographic or watershed conditions that require additional guidelines that you write as a community, or that maybe things that are exempted or not being used. So for, on one side you might have outstanding waters, individual watershed goals, TMDL requirements that make you want to have something additional in a guideline. There also might be some things that where some certain BMPs are prohibited, maybe wellhead protection areas, you don't want certain things used because of those concerns. So just different things like that, if there's anything critical that you have an overlay district to add or exclude. Specific restrictions or specific requirements, additional rules on how to manage water quality volume. I think Greg mentioned this before, some communities want more than wet ponds or stormwater wetlands to address them, so maybe there's an additional infiltration-based type practice that's required, or you can't only do a wet pond to achieve the goals. So that would be a restriction, or things that are required. Thinking about what kinds of things you want in submittals or to know about up front. Do you want a soil management plan, a stormwater management plan, natural resource inventory, any other specific things that would want to be put together as you're looking at the ordinance process or the process to get submittals. Required enforcement or different inspection. So what documents would you like as a review and approval process if you're looking at the adoption of whatever rules you want? So do you want maintenance agreements? Do you want covenants or easements that allow for operation and maintenance of BMPs, maybe on private property? What does that maintenance scenario look like? I think some of our groups kind of hit on some of those key pieces. Just some things to think about. And then another real important side of it is, how about inspection of the BMPs during construction? Having that well-documented process and who's going to complete the inspections and what stages are they required at, especially as you're beginning, are really important, because not everybody really understands what's trying to be achieved out there, and it might even go against the way they're used to doing work. We've seen landscapers fill in bioretention cells up to the top so that the pipe is even with the ground, because they couldn't imagine having a ponding depth that you need for bioretention. So, some of those things that you might want to inspect before they go too far, or you don't know what's underground and if it's going to work. And then floodplain management and stream buffers. Specific needs for policies related to both topics, so that you know how you're going to address that as part of the overall package that's being put together. And then the plan review process steps. So creating a plan review process and having some kind of checklist of materials to be submitted for review. And one of the things that's been really helpful for me as a reviewer of practices that have to follow these specific rules in order to get state or other funding is having a process that asks for the information in a specific way, so that you don't have to look through 100 pages of stuff that somebody did differently than the next person and the next person. if there's a standard way to look at it, whether it be, you know, a design review Excel document that was created for the stormwater wetland or something that you do yourself, just so that it maybe makes that process streamlined for review and looking at, did they get the calcs done in the proper way, and is this designed according to the manual, and is it going to function the way we want? So those types of, you know, that type of plan review process steps going to be important in getting what you want out of it most easily. So, and then the technical documents. What technical documents do you want? And, you know, when you create a local policy, it's really helpful if you can have a system that allows those to be updated without additional council approval, so that, you know, it maybe ties back to the manual and not having to recreate all that within your document to have to make big changes every time one of these things changes. We talked about defining those terms that are being used. And, you know, if there are specific design techniques or practices that are discouraged, those, you know, would be something that you would want to share in these technical documents as well. And one of the other steps in there talks about better site design, so encouraging, you know, some of those concepts as you look at larger areas, the preserving of open space, you know, reducing impervious cover so you have less of that runoff to deal with, minimizing runoff, and treating water as a resource. So there's a lot of times when we're looking at some of these, you know, bigger areas that we might be able to create a nice amenity that people don't even see as stormwater management, but just as an amenity. So, you know, if you look at Iowa's Guidance for Stormwater Design, this question came up earlier by Mark, is, you know, how do you look at that? And so there's, you know, a number of different guidance information. So we have the Iowa Stormwater Management Manual, and that's really the preferential document to be used for the design of BMPs that address water quality and quantity. And then anything that's in there we want to use for that. In SUDAS, what they have there is for stormwater that we want to use would be the storm sewer systems and the culvert design type process, because that is not covered at all in ISWIM. So if it's not covered at all in the stormwater manual, then that's where we look to SUDAS for the guidance. And then the river restoration toolbox really talks about the stream restoration practices as Iowa's guidance document. So if you have a local ordinance, then those types of things should be addressed on, you know, when you want to use what guidance document. Any questions related to those 2 pages? I kind of breezed through the 14-point items and tried to kind of group them so you could kind of see that, you know, there's some areas to address when we go about saying, hey, we're going to adopt ISWIM, or we're going to use the unified sizing criteria, a couple of the key points that go with it. But any other burning questions related to those 14 steps before we discuss it as groups? Anybody awake? Couple
Just
people.
Amy.
Just Amy. Good.
So we would like you to get back into your groups, because, you know, last summer was it last summer? Maybe the summer before, I lost track of time.
However you want to call it.
Kind of a speaker series, education series. And as we reconvened, you know, last time we kind of recapped what we had previously done, had a little bit of discussion about conceptual layers, and then today, kind of diving deep into the unified sizing criteria and ISWIM. But, you know, to get out of conceptual, we need to then move on to, well, what are we going to create? What's the end product? So we'd ask you in your groups to talk about, what does the Capital Crossroads end product look like? Whatever that is, how is it adopted and implemented? How do we know we're successful, and what other training for implementation would be needed once it is adopted, so that we can be successful in maintaining and implementing whatever is adopted. And so again, I'll bring the lights up again, and would ask each group to spend some time talking through those, and that'll give us some guidance. So.